Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the virtual Pérez Art Museum Miami. My name is Marie Vickles, and I'm the Director of Education. And tonight, we are presenting the online version of our Local Views at PAMM program with humanities educator, public historian, and PAMM teaching artist, Darwin Rodriguez. This live virtual Local Views program is presented with the generous support of the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation, and features Miami-based artists sharing their practice and discussing works of art on view at the museum that connect in various ways to their own work. This casual 30-minute conversation takes place every Thursday, now online, at 6 p.m. via Facebook Live and YouTube Live. I would like to extend a sincere and heartfelt thanks to all of you for joining us tonight. As a 21st century museum dedicated to representing the diverse and multicultural communities of South Florida, the Pérez Art Museum Miami continues to strive to be a forum for open, honest, and at times challenging dialogue while creating understanding through the power of art. And art has the power to not only inspire, but to help us understand the critical role of history and its influence on the process and very creation of art. It is at this juncture of art historical discourse that Darwin's work truly flourishes and enlightens. Before I introduce Darwin, I would like to acknowledge and thank the incredible team of people that work so very hard to make these programs come together online. Thank you to Anita Bram, Associate Director of Adult Programs and Audience Engagement, Alan Mueller, Membership Manager, and our world-class AV team, Denise Faxes and Andrew Bird. This program could literally not happen without you. So thank you all. All right, let's get started. Darwin Rodriguez is a public historian and humanities educator that believes in the lowering of barriers to knowledge in order to foster increased cross-cultural understanding. A former Miami-Dade County Public School teacher, he is currently a lead teaching artist at Pérez Art Museum Miami and an adjunct history professor at Florida International University. His scholarship has focused on the massive traumatic events around the world, as well as how the Atlantic slave trade is taught in the contemporary American classroom. As a museum educator, Rodriguez is working to create opportunities for teachers and students of different backgrounds to use art spaces as a medium to discuss pressing issues that stem from their everyday surroundings and realities. As you watch along this evening on Facebook or YouTube Live, please post questions for Darwin. He will try to answer as many as possible during the Q&A portion of this evening's presentation. And remember, if you value this and other programs presented by the museum, please consider supporting us by going to pam.org/donate. So with that being said, please join me in giving a warm welcome to Darwin Rodriguez.
Thanks, Marie. I'd like to echo that very heartfelt thanks to all of our staff, especially our AV staff, for putting this together, and thank you for this platform. So thank you, everybody, for joining me. This is going to be a bit of an unconventional local views. For one, usually every Thursday you'll see an artist here, and I know that some of my coworkers are probably watching and are going to correct me and say that you are an artist, but I don't consider myself an artist. I am a historian. That's what I do. It is what I labor in. It is my practice. So what I'm going to be doing is sharing sort of my journey into the museum and talking about sort of the methods that I use in the museum and out of the museum, and also sharing resources that I think are going to help everybody, I think, understand a lot of what's currently sort of taking place in our country and in our culture. So a little bit about myself. As you see, there's an image of me here at the museum. I give lots of tours to different groups, mostly school tours and school groups. I also work with teens. And as Marie mentioned, I'm a teaching artist, but I'll get into that later on. A bit about myself. I was originally born in New York City. I was born in Harlem. I grew up in Washington Heights in the Bronx, and I moved to Miami about 15 years ago. But even though I moved to Miami as an adult, I think a lot of people in South Florida use hurricanes to sort of date themselves. So I was here for Andrew in '92. I spent summers here with my grandma, so I was definitely in Hialeah in 1992, experiencing Hurricane Andrew with probably a lot of our viewers tonight. As Marie mentioned, I teach at FIU, but I'm also a graduate of FIU. I'm what we call a double Panther. I got my BA and my master's there, and I currently work at PAMM, and let's keep going. So I know that this is a very like text-heavy slide, and that's not what you're supposed to do in a PowerPoint. This is the most writing you're going to see at one point, so bear with me. So here I sort of organize like what I do in terms of my labor, and my pedagogy is sort of the methods that I use to tackle these many hats that I wear. So as Marie mentioned, and as I mentioned earlier, my first and my full-time role is I am a teaching artist at PAMM. I sort of add museum educator to that because I think it more correctly rounds out what I do. Again, because I chafe at this artist idea. I'm not a creative. I'm an educator first and foremost. And in terms of my pedagogy, one thing I did learn at PAMM was the inquiry method. Right? We teach students when they come into PAMM to critically engage the artwork on their own. We give them a set of tools to understand the artwork for themselves as opposed to us just delivering the information. And I think inquiry and visual thinking strategies really help anybody in and outside of the classroom. So we're trying to help students learn to look at art for themselves when they do come to the museum. And I labor in this with 12 other amazing and very, very talented artists, the teaching artists who I hope to resume this task of educating Miami's youth in PAMM's beautiful environment very soon. Moving on, I'm also one of the facilitators for the PAMM's Teen Art Council, or we call it PTAC for short. And I call PTAC or the PAMM Teen Arts Council, they're sort of PAMM's shadow government. They're a group of 13 to 12 teens. They work throughout the school year, and in this amazing program, we expose these teens to the inner workings of the museum, and they also put on events and market these events for themselves to bring more teens and young people into the museum. And again, in terms of my pedagogy, the methods that I think guide me in this is mentorship. I wouldn't be at the position I am without people acting on my behalf. Case in point, Marie hired me. Marie took me on as an intern before I had a full-time position at PAMM. And, I feel that mentorship is certainly at the core of what I do as an educator, and also inclusivity. I really want PTAC and the members of PTAC to reflect Miami-Dade County's reality when it comes to where these teens are coming from and what neighborhoods they're coming from, and really look like a cross-section of our city. So just moving down the line, I'm also an adjunct history professor. So I work at FIU part-time, where I teach American history and I teach European history. And I think that my sort of tack and the methods that I use, I'm very much so about unsilencing history, and I'll talk about that later on because I'd like to move on. I'm also a digital historian. I'm very interested in how people learn about these complex means in digital and in new and engaging ways. I consider myself public, as in that I'm in the service of the public. I want my things to be accessible and open to everybody. And lastly, I'm a Holocaust educator. I've had the good fortune of traveling to lots of historic sites in Europe where a lot of the events that are tied to the Holocaust and the education of the Holocaust are sort of reproduced, and I wear that badge proudly. So in the interest of time, I'm going to keep going, and I'm just going to sort of share this like triptych of my classroom. I was originally a social studies teacher, and as I taught over the years, I realized that students really gravitated toward visual learning styles. A lot of my students were visual learners, so my classroom became one where history had to come to life in a visual way. And I always realized that students were able to better apply their knowledge once they were able to visualize it, which is why I employed timelines and so much art, and I felt like my students were very thirsty and hungry for art. I ended up teaching AP European history and AP art history. And even while I was a history teacher and an art history teacher, I was always sort of questioning for myself, like, why are these the subjects that I'm teaching? Why is there an AP European history, but there isn't an AP African history and AP Latin American history? Why is AP art history why is over 70% of what I have to teach really the art of only one part of the globe? So I've always sort of had this critical outlook on what I was teaching. So there were two critical moments, I think, that sort of pushed me into the direction, I think, of museum work. And I'd like to share that with you. So as a New Yorker, I make yearly pilgrimages to the Met. I'm like one of the Met's biggest like fans. So even though I don't live in New York, I make a pilgrimage every year. And one year when I went to the Met, I saw this show called China Through the Looking Glass. And it was at this moment where I decided, like, I want to work in a museum. I want to have a seat at the table where the decisions and the ideas that go into this are made. So in this, I think, very interesting artwork, what I loved about it was that it was critical of our own perception of China, of a different culture, of a different country, of a different society, and it did it through art. And I love the way that it was, by virtue of being in a museum, this is a conversation that was had with visual imagery, and it was being had with the public. So I personally loved how you got to see a Buddha statue next to these beautiful objects of art, because it's put on by the Met Costume Institute. So that juxtaposition I thought was beautiful and very thoughtful. And it was at this moment where I really thought to myself, right, I think this is where what I want to explore in terms of knowledge and sharing knowledge, where I think it can happen best. So moving on, I also really liked how it transformed the space. If you've been to the Met or been to any of these very like large and older institutions that sort of replicate a Greek temple from the outside in these large spaces, China Through the Looking Glass completely altered the inside of the museum, which, albeit expensive, I think that we can find ways to transform what we learn and how we learn in more adaptable ways, in digital ways. So that was the first sort of like pivot into the museum world. It was this moment of China Through the Looking Glass. And then the sort of next pivot for me was my trip to Germany in the summer of 2016. I was fortunate enough to be selected through a scholarship I applied for, and was a guest of the German Foreign Ministry, and we were toured at historic sites in Germany. And by no means I hope that looking at these memorials of Jewish history and Jewish life and the Holocaust, I do not mean to reduce Germany's history to just these two images, but I selected these two because they were also this crucial moment for me in understanding how we memorialize things. What are the narratives that are being reproduced with the things that we see every day, what I call like street furniture? And I think these are very current debates, right? In the statues that we see, in the names that are memorialized on streets, right? So I got to see a very up close example of how another country is dealing with a very, very problematic moment in its history. And just for some context, these large black steles that you see, which is the memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe, is one block from Germany's legislature. And German lawmakers see this. It's a stone's throw away from where they labor today. And I think that there's a deliberate placement of these centers of power and these centers of memorialization that I think is lacking in the United States of America, and I think is something that we are only now dawning on, despite the fact that many people have been saying that this is something we should have done for a long time. And then the other image that you see of these metallic faces is in the Jewish Museum of Berlin, which is a very, very large space, but there's so much empty space in it. And I feel that the museum says so much about absence, and there's so much about memorialization in the spaces that are empty. So it's this large cavernous room, and this sort of is getting us to think about sort of what's no longer there and what no longer can be there because of what happened. It's a beautiful museum. It was designed by Daniel Liebeskind, and just thinking of contemporary art museums and contemporary art spaces as other places that reproduce narratives and reproduce memory. So this is another sort of critical point for me where I thought, where in Miami are we having these conversations, and can these conversations occur? And what do I need to do to get there? So before I move on, I want to share this word, and people that have heard me give talks like this are probably going to laugh because I might butcher the German, but it's a wonderfully German word. It's it's Vergangenheitsbewältigung. And ultimately, this word means overcoming the past, literally. So what I saw in Germany is one thing that I think that we are still trying to grapple with in the United States of America. And I think that at PAMM and in our collection and what I do as a museum educator, this is still something that I think motivates me every day. In the thoughtful selections of the curators, in the programming that we put on in education, in the inquiry method, what is it what we're seeing about the art that's getting us to think thoughtfully about what happened in the past and what happened in the past that we don't know about because it was silenced. So again, going back to these questions that I was asking myself as a teacher, where are these conversations happening? Why should I continue to study the past? Who is deciding these narratives? Who decides what gets put up and what we study, and where is that narrative continue to be reproduced? And what are we not getting? What is still being silenced? So again, as I mulled over these ideas, I realized that one of the few places I felt that happened was at PAMM. As an avid goer of museums from childhood and going to PAMM since it opened, even when it was MAM, I felt that the artwork there was questioning me to think about these accepted narratives. So that's when I decided to go back to school and really grow my knowledge base and my skill set as a historian. So I'm going to share some resources with you very quickly, and I invite you to take a look at them and reach out to me if you want any more guidance on them. But first, I'd like to share, I'd like to highlight Michel Rolfe-Triot, who is a Haitian anthropologist. He sadly passed away in 2012, but his book, Silencing the Past, for me was formative in understanding how history is a story that is agreed upon by people in power, and power manifests itself in a lot of different ways. And I would like to highlight one passage here in a chapter where he talks about the Haitian Revolution, all right? The Haitian Revolution, he defines it as an unthinkable history. He says it was unthinkable to the West because it challenged slavery and racism, full stop, right? So the Haitian Revolution becomes this silenced history that I feel we should centralize, especially as Americans, especially in 21st century American, as this seminal moment where racism was rejected in a very definitive and in a very successful manner. So there are these vignettes, these moments in this book where he sort of picks apart history and gives us this sort of silenced version of it. So definitely this book, if you're thinking about going down that avenue, and thinking about, again, being a Holocaust educator, I think one of the most effective tools in teaching any history, but especially the Holocaust, are individual stories. Humans react, I think, better when they can humanize and personalize these large and abstract things. And as we abstract large traumatic issues like the Holocaust and like slavery, and we reduce them to statistics, we lose that human connection. So the next book I'd like to quickly talk about is The Slave Ship by Marcus Rediker. In this book, it is a history book, but it reads like a novel. You are going to get individual narratives of people that were indelibly tied to the slave trade. So you will read about people that were purchased as cargo, people that were placed in shackles and transported against their wills across an ocean. You will read about the captains. You will read about you will read about the financiers and the millions of people involved in this global enterprise that I still don't think we've fully reckoned with as a nation. And moving on to some digital platforms that I think anybody can access. This is a great website called slavevoyages.org. It's maintained by a group of universities where you can, for yourself, see where slave ships docked, where they purchased individuals by the millions, transported them, where many died along the way, to the New World, right? To ports in the Caribbean, North America, and South America. And it's a lot of data, but the way that it visualizes, I think, is a good entry point for someone that's trying to explore a lot of these silenced histories. Again, we have to be careful that we don't abstract all of this violence against individuals and just leave it at numbers, but I think it's a thoughtful place to start. Moving on, here's another digital history project that's created by the University of Richmond in Virginia. It's called Mapping Inequality. So if we want to think about, again, these issues that are still affecting the United States today, and in how people are able to acquire wealth and thus power, we can go back almost a century and see how certain groups of people, how Black people in particular, were literally zeroed out, right? Forbidden from creating wealth for themselves because the federal government would not guarantee loans in red line zones, which were neighborhoods where Black people lived. So I welcome you to also explore this digital project. And then I'm going to briefly talk about the ones that I've been working on. While I was an intern at PAMM, this artwork by Susan Hiller, Lost and Found, was on view, where you would see a soundtrack of a language and hear a translation of it, which I thought was very thought-provoking. So I created a website that mapped where these languages were spoken. Because again, if we think about what the United States is and the land that we're on, I feel like one of these silenced histories is who actually lived on that land and where they live today. So this was sort of the beginning of my practice as a digital historian, so to speak. And after that, I started working at PAMM full time. And I want to highlight this work as part of our collection, as I think a work of art that ties together a lot of the things that I hold dear, right? Which is, silenced histories, which is talking about these difficult subjects and doing it in a public venue with as many people as possible. So I've had the good luck of touring this piece many, many times with students of all ages, and getting to talk about the Rwandan genocide and asking students questions, deliberately crafted questions, if they know what a genocide is and how these visual cues, how they understand them and how they interpret them. And I can honestly say that almost every time that I get into a very thoughtful conversation with this, other patrons in the museum would stop and listen. And I think that really is where being a teaching artist and working at PAMM is, I think, most rewarding for me. So I'm going to pause here and sort of leave it on this slide briefly in case anyone has any questions. But I'm also going to briefly highlight what I'm working on now as part of my digital practice. I'm currently using graphical information systems and in doing GIS, trying to create digital and interactive maps that show us the sort of global connection to the Atlantic slave trade and where it started and where it originated and in quantities and in totals, and layer that with, I think, methods of use like maps. Everyone uses a map on their phone. So it's more familiar and easy for us to understand. So that's where I am here. And I can also move on to just share my general contact information. I do have a website for my practice, and you can email me directly, and I have an Instagram for my practice, and then a personal one where you'll mostly see pictures of me baking, mostly like cakes and breads, as well as my Facebook. So any questions? All right, so we have a question from Marie. How can non-educators think more about the untold stories of history? And it's a very good question, because I feel that so much of what I mean, as an educator, right, you're beyond busy. You have all of these things that you have to do. So really taking some time out of your lesson plans and grading to think about these untold stories that you're not getting in a textbook, that you're not getting in the standards, I think is a tall order. So where it happened for me? It happened at the museum. I would say come to one of our shows, come to one of our expertly curated shows like polyphonic or see the permanent collection, and read about some of the things that we have on display. And I think you'll start to get an inkling of some of these silenced histories, so these untold stories of history. You could also come to one of our educator workshops. That's another shameless plug for education and what we do at PAMM. So, okay, I have another question from Asair. Great to hear from you, Asair. He says, hey, Darwin, this is an unthinkable question, but how would you analyze a person or a world without history? I think that's such an Asair question, and thank you for it, right? I think that history, again, history itself is a construct, right? Like I said before, history is an agreed upon story, right? So I would say that we don't need this capital H history, Asair. I think that a person and a world is able to do that self-analysis on their own, right? In the same way that I consider myself a mentor to teens, like I am a mentor, I think on all of our paths to this type of learning, but I am not the authority, nor do I claim to be the all-knowing everything about history. All right, they're really coming in now. Alex asks, why are digital tools so important to you as a person, an art historian and a practitioner? Yeah, that's a really good question. I don't know, maybe because of my like sort of age demographic. I'm too young to be a digital native. I'm too old to be a digital native. I'm the Gen Zer, grew up with digital tools, with iPads, right? But I'm too young where like I grew up with, I think, a lot of facility with a lot of these tools. And I think that I just think that in the direction that we're heading in, we would be limiting ourselves if we didn't explore digital realms as another method of learning. So another question from Lori. Great to hear from you, Lori, and Alex as well. How do we move forward to unsilence the silenced histories? I think we got to keep talking about it, right? Like that big German word I said, like this process is never done, right? There's this idea that the things that happened in the past happened. We can't change them. But I think we all have a moral obligation to continue to labor to talk about these things, because nothing that we do can ever fully make some of the people that experience this or their descendants whole. So at the very minimum, we should continue to talk about it. All right, I have another question from Angela. Great to hear from you, Angela. How has your experience working with visual artists informed your practice as a historian? That's a great question. Sometimes I do feel like a fish out of water because in my head, I'm like the one academic in a room of like creatives. And I think it's made me more creative. I think this idea is that I really think a picture's worth 1,000 words. So I think that we can tell these stories, we can reach wider audiences through the arts as opposed to through academics sometimes. I have a question from Yariel. Do or have you incorporated art into your baking? Yes. The running joke, I think, with some of my coworkers is that that baking is my art as in my amateur and my spare time. I have another question from Ria. It says, how do we start telling these untold stories to our youth? Is it just the parents' responsibility? That's a great question. And I'm going to quote my good friend, Shire, who have had the pleasure of working with Lonnie and with Marie on a very, I think, important program at PAMM called Art Detectives, which is we have to be comfortable with being uncomfortable. So we need to start having these conversations with ourselves first before we can start having them with our youth. But I think that both need to happen at the same time. And it's I think we're getting toward that time. So Yariel asks once again, given that for the most part history is written by the powerful, how do we find stories about the least powerful in society? Well, it's going to take some digging, but there is history from below. History doesn't have to be great man history, need not be from the top, which is what I think you see a lot in texts. We can find individual anecdotes, we can find individual stories. It just requires, I think, a bit more digging. You know who's really good at helping you find stuff? Librarians. There are people that are experts at this, not just historians. So go to your library and find out. Catherine, great to hear from you, Kat, asks, what local contemporary artists do you see documenting history in the making? All right, so I didn't get a chance to bring in her work, but I have a family member named Joydi Minaya who recently shrouded or wrapped Columbus's statue by Bayside Bayside Park. And she has this sort of ongoing series where she takes these monuments to Columbus and colonialism and wraps them in tropical fabric. So she's an example, I think, of a contemporary artist that's getting us to challenge how we memorialize and how we construct and think about the past. Shire Regans asks, how do you feel about the statues of trash historical figures being yanked down? I'm just going to point to that, Shire. Do you see that? I think that's my answer there, if I'm going to be demure. But I mean, to be completely honest, right, I think a lot of the arguments that we get about these statues, and I'm going to use Germany as another example, right, is you don't see statues in Germany, you know, dedicated to Hitler and the Third Reich, right? This idea that, oh, we can put a plaque on it and that's going to help contextualize it, that what dominates the landscape? The statue, right? So, you know, again, what dominates the landscape in Berlin today? It's the memorial to the crimes that the Nazis committed. So I think that there are lots of false equivalencies made about these statues that I personally don't agree with. Question from Fran. Do other museums have someone in positions like you or the one you have at PAMM? That's a good question, Fran. I don't know. I think in a way I sort of carved out this unique sort of position as a historian, contextualizer, tour giver, teen person, and I couldn't have done that again without, you know, the support of my director, of Marie, and the support of PAMM's wonderful staff. Question from Corey. Corey asks, you started as an intern and wanted your teen council to reflect the diversity of Miami. How important is it for museums to strive for inclusivity, and what areas of inclusivity is most needed? Oof, that's the $64,000 question. I think that if you go to a museum often enough and you don't see a reflection of yourself in it, then you're going to wonder why not, and I think you're going to wonder who the museum is for. So I think that across all levels, museums should reflect their community as much as they possibly can, and the onus is on us. The onus is on the institution to make the effort to bring down those barriers. I mean, case in point, we have like Overtown is less than a mile away from where PAMM is, and even though we do tour lots of local schools and we do have these wonderful outreach programs with Overtown Youth Center, there are still people that are within a stone's throw of PAMM that are not coming in through the doors. So at every level, we need to do more. And I'm gonna, it's already 6:33. I know I'm already over time. We have another question from Ria. She said, have you considered writing a book about this? So I just have a master's. I'm not toying with a doctorate, I think, anytime soon, but I have not written that off yet. So, all right, one more from Alan. Hi, Darwin. It's important for young Black, Indigenous, people of color youth to learn about their history, often left out of textbooks, movies, and even art collections. As some museum and institutions begin to take steps to remedy this, what are you hoping to see? That's a really great question. I think that, something that I think we could even start with land acknowledgement, like understanding that like where the land we're on, like who used to be here and who used to call this home. And I think that if you tune into, and I'm not saying that you're not, but I think that, like, given the programming that our department does and tries to execute with curatorial, with marketing, with development, like hand in hand at PAMM, I really think that what we do is unique among institutions. And I PAMM is only the second museum I've worked in, but in speaking with other colleagues and seeing what's going on, in other institutions around the country and around the world, I'd say that we're ahead of the curve, but that doesn't mean that we should rest on our laurels. And I have a comment, not a question, from a former student. She's ecstatic to see me continue to educate local youth and minority youth and the preservation of art history. So it's great to hear from you, Jasmine. I've known you for like a decade now, since I taught you social studies like years ago. And it's great to hear from everybody. So that being said, I've left you here with my contact information. DRDH Group is my Instagram handle, where I will post more of my digital initiatives and more of my writing and my perspective on art history, and culture. Once we're able to come back to the museum, I really hope that you can come and say hi, because I'll probably be at PAMM pretty often. At least I hope I will be. So thank you very much for tonight. I'd like to thank Denise and Andrew and Marie and everyone at PAMM and my coworkers. And that's it for now. Thank you very much.